Hi there, everybody, and welcome to Mondays with Mike. I'm Chief Meteorologist Mike Yiskovitz here at Fox 26, and this is my weekly show here, 1 p.m. on Fox Local. Fox Local for your smart TV. If you haven't downloaded it for your phone, you could now take us with you. All of our news and weather and extra content like this from your phone or your tablet. So anyway, that's Fox Local. So download it at the App Store if you haven't done that already. Today, lots to talk about. I mean, obviously, look, some people are watching and saying, come on, just get to the forecast. Well, I don't usually do the forecast per se on this. We go in depth into some other topics. But I will tell you that the forecast for this week looks warm. In fact, this outlook here shows us that we're likely to stay above average on our temperatures for the rest of this week, most likely this upcoming weekend and early next week as well. So we got a few things coming up I want to talk about today. The one that I'm most excited about is space weather. We're talking about activity from the sun that could affect the Earth over the next several months. I'll explain what that's all about. And we'll also take a look at some recent activity in the tropics that is contributing more and more and more to adding more names to that list for this year, and what's turning out to be a pretty active hurricane season. And we'll also talk about the winter outlook that was released by NOAA just last week and what it could mean for our wintertime here across Texas and across other parts of the USA. So a lot to talk about, beginning with a look at changes in the sun that might have an effect on the Earth, what we call space weather. Let's head over here to the other big monitor. Let's talk about the sun and talk about space weather. Now, you may think, come on, space weather, is that really a thing? Yes, indeed it is, because the sun does not send us a constant, non-changing supply of light, constant non-changing range of frequencies, and it's also not sending us non-changing, consistent amounts of particles. It changes. Sometimes it's in a lull, sometimes it gets very active, and you've probably heard of the northern lights, the so-called aurora. We also have the southern lights, and a lot of those can, the area that could be seen, where they could be seen, and the intensity in which they appear in the sky can be affected a lot by some of these cycles that happen with the sun and how it changes the particles that are ejected from the sun and the radiation that's released from the sun. So the highlight really that we got this week from NASA was that they have now said that we are reaching or have reached what's called a solar maximum. So what are we talking about here? Well, astronomers actually noted a couple of hundred years ago, they've known this for a couple of hundred years, about sunspots. And sunspots are dark areas on the sun, and they're associated with very active flares of the sun and disruptions in the magnetic field of the sun. So you would think if there are dark spots, that means there's less energy coming from the sun, but it really doesn't. When there are more dark spots, you have sort of a more chaotic situation on the sun's surface that faces us. Remember, actually the sun turns, just like the moon turns and the Earth turns, and there's a rotation of all the objects in our solar system. The sun rotates as well. And so we end up with a cycle every 11 years, approximately. We have peaks and valleys of solar activity. Now, the last solar maximum that we had was back in the early 2010s, and now we're reaching another solar maximum for late 2024 and heading into 2025. Now, we've already had some familiarity with this. I mean, remember back in the spring when a lot of people in Texas saw a very faint version of the northern lights and the aurora? Remember, it turned out a little bit better when folks were taking pictures with their phones than seeing it with the naked eye. But the bottom line is that it was pretty remarkable that so many people across the United States could see the aurora borealis, or the northern lights. Well, that had to do with a very active, what's called a coronal mass ejection, which is a very large release of mass from the sun in the form of charged particles. These are like protons and electrons and various other ions. It's mostly like hydrogen ions. And they fly across at about 1 million miles an hour. They don't move at the speed of light, by the way. about 1,000,000 miles per hour. And when they arrive at the Earth, they're steered by the Earth's magnetic field to both the North and South Pole, where they interact with the Earth's ionosphere and create these bright, beautiful displays of the aurora. Well, they happen more often during solar peaks, and that is where it appears we're at right now. Now, that becomes a concern because these peaks in solar activity can sometimes lead to flares of active areas of ultraviolet radiation and other signals that can interrupt with, let's say, radio transmissions. They can cause damage to satellites or cause some temporary outages, even potentially in the internet. So there's a really important reason that we have to pay attention to some of the changing cycles of the sun. And for this year and probably next year, there's going to be a lot to follow, probably more frequent ejections of mass and also some blasts of energy in the form of radiation coming to us from the sun. So let me tell you what NOAA and NASA said last week. They released a statement where they announced that the sun has reached its solar maximum period. So they had a teleconference with reporters last week. This was last Tuesday, kind of got overshadowed by a lot of other stuff we had going on in the world of weather. But the solar cycle is part of, like I said, this natural cycle that runs roughly every 11 years. And this has been something that's noted for at least a couple of hundred years, probably even going back to the time of Galileo is when they started studying this sort of thing and noticing the sunspot cycle. Now, during this most active part of the cycle, which is known as the solar maximum, the sun can unleash these immense explosions of light, radiation, at various parts of the spectrum, as well as just energized particles, and they can affect electric grids, power grids, satellites, and things like that around the Earth. And when we reach these solar maximum periods, these types of events become much more active, like the big one that we had back in May that led to a lot of you being able to see the Northern Lights for the first time and maybe the only time in your life. So some images come to us from what's called the Solar Dynamics Observatory. Here's an example, and it also was responsible for some of the animations you were seeing behind me in the monitor. This is a look at a comparison here where we can see sort of what the sun looks like normally, and then what it looks like when it's in one of these super active periods during the solar maximum. Now, we're looking at ultraviolet radiation right here. So this happens a lot when we take a look at space stuff. When you see images from the Hubble Space Telescope, and then also, lots of other telescopes in space, you're going to see various wavelengths of light that have to get converted to visible so that we can sort of visualize what they're seeing, because sometimes we look at infrared radiation and sometimes we look at ultraviolet radiation. Bottom line is the sun looks a lot fancier there, a lot more interesting on the right side. We also could take a look at sunspots. And like I mentioned just a moment ago, sunspots are associated with the maximum in solar activity. The sun is very dynamic. The sun is changing. The sun is churning, kind of like a living object, sort of. But there are lots of changes in the sun's magnetic field, the amount of activity that comes out of the sun as far as bursts of different frequencies of radiation and bursts of particles. And so a lot of times these things will fly away from the sun and it's not pointed at the Earth, so we don't really notice it or care other than just studying it. Sometimes it comes out from the side of the sun that's opposite the Earth, and so we would never even notice. But whenever these sunspots are on our side, a lot of times you'll get one of these big explosions that points in our direction and become a big issue. Now, these solar sunspot cycles, we actually have records of them all the way back to the early 1700s. And in fact, I think we could probably get some unofficial records even before that. But, a lot of people say, well, how do we know what happened with the sun 200 years ago, 250 years ago? Well, remember, there were astronomers back then. In fact, folks, of course, have been studying the sun for eons, thousands of years, but we have been tracking the position of these sunspots for a long, long time. And astronomers have been keeping charts of it. And this graph that goes up and down shows you this cycle that every century we end up with about 10 of these peaks, 9 or 10. It depends, on some of them are very strong, some of them are very weak. One of the strongest ones on the chart there was back in the 1950s and early 1960s, and it kind of goes up and down since then. And right now we're at a particularly strong one, the strongest one that we've had since about the year 2000. And nowadays, now they didn't used to do this 200 years ago or even 50 years ago, but now NASA and NOAA can make some predictions as to the solar cycle and when it's getting more active or less active. And it looks like right now they are predicting, that's the red line that you're looking at, is the predicted value for the solar activity. And notice it peaks in early 2025. So we're talking about that January to February timeframe. So that's the red line. Now the black line that you see is what's actually been observed. So the value of what we've measured here as far as sunspots has actually gone beyond the predicted value. So what that means is that the sun may turn out to be more active and send us more frequent explosions and more frequent ejections of particles and more frequent bursts of radiation than was even predicted. So that's why this is kind of a big deal, and space weather can be a pretty big deal and a pretty interesting thing for us to see. Finally, so this purple image here is pretty amazing. Now keep in mind, you would not be able to see this obviously, because all we can see with our naked eye is just the sun is so bright with visible light, can't see anything. But with different imaging methods that NOAA and NASA have, for example, in NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory, they could look at, like I said, things like ultraviolet radiation, which is what this is showing, ultraviolet light. And this burst that you see there, which is right sort of in the middle and lower part of the sun, is called an X9 flare. So an X is the type of flare that it is, and a 9.0 is sort of like the way they classify earthquakes, with like a magnitude 9 would be a gigantic earthquake. And so this is very similar to that. Now this was measured on October the 3rd, just a few weeks ago, and just 3 weeks ago. And so this caused more intense northern lights across much of the country. So we weren't able to see it here, although some people might have seen it just a little bit to the north. So anyway, yeah, these things are measured and actually monitored on a real-time basis. In fact, I think NASA takes a new picture of the sun about every 10 seconds or so, 10 or 15 seconds. So it's pretty amazing to see. So look, the bottom line is, this is going to be a topic of conversation. I mean, obviously, we're not going to be talking about it necessarily every day, what's happening with the sun. We're going to be talking more about highs and lows and precipitation and all of that kind of stuff. But you'll probably occasionally, or maybe more often, hear over the next 6 months or so about solar flares and about seeing the northern lights maybe more frequently during the wintertime and things like that. So yeah, the solar cycle reaching its maximum, that's the big news in the world of space weather. Okay, now enough about the sun. Let's talk about the impact that the sun could have on our forecast, more specifically, the winter outlook. So NOAA just last week released their outlook for the winter. It's called a seasonal outlook or a 3-month outlook. So this is a look at the expected departure from normal of the weather for December, January, February. Now, this doesn't mean this is what it's going to be like every single day. We're talking about on average, this is the trend. So the influence here is what we call La Nina. Now, La Nina is way down there as far as an oscillation that takes place between warmer than average water temperatures in the Pacific near the equator. We call that an El Nino. And then cooler than normal conditions, which we call a La Nina. Now, when we have the cooler condition phase, it tends to cause our jet stream to move a little farther to the north. And so when that happens, it opens up the opportunity for much of the country to run above average on temperatures. And so this is the December, January, February temperature outlook. And notice from California all the way across to Florida and including Texas, we expect to have above average temperatures. Of course, like I mentioned, doesn't mean every day is going to be hot. It just means that when you take that 3-month time frame, it's likely that we are going to have above average conditions overall. And it also looks like we're going to stay abnormally dry as well. So when we take a look at this 3-month time frame, this is pretty typical of what we see in La Nina years, where we have a little bit more sunshine and slightly milder weather. Now, that's the exact opposite, by the way, of what we see in El Nino winters, which is where we tend to be kind of drippy and dreary and cloudy and sprinkly. In the case of La Nina, we tend to see less of that, at least across our part of the world. Now, that becomes a little bit more of a concern because, as you've probably heard me say here over the last week or so, we are slipping back into a drought. Much of Texas under a drought. There are a couple of holes in the drought there, but for the most part, we are in drought conditions. A moderate drought here in Houston, a very extreme drought out in parts of West Texas, by the way, and across parts of Central Texas also. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I had to hit something on the camera. So when we take a look at what's happening here locally, a reminder that just about all of our local counties, the county judges have placed us under burning bans. And so you are not permitted. It's unlawful to burn anything outdoors. And with that extended forecast, looking like we're going to stay on the dry side throughout much of the winter, it looks like the drought and the dry conditions and the potential for wildfires and grass fires could be something that we're talking about here for the next several months. On to the tropics and what continues to actually be a really busy hurricane season. We know it has been wild as far as the number of hurricanes that have hit the Gulf Coast, with Beryl hitting the Gulf Coast as a Category 1, but reaching Category 5 status in the Caribbean Sea. Actually set a record for that. So Beryl was a Gulf Coast landfall. Debbie was. Francine was. Debbie hit Florida. Francine hit Louisiana. We had Helene hitting Florida. We had Milton being a big-time storm, obviously just hitting Florida. Did not hit as a 5, but did hit as a very a strong hurricane, luckily weakened, a little bit before making landfall in Florida. So yeah, what a busy season it has been. And now we actually had 2 additional storms that formed, very short-lived, but added to the totals. So we had Tropical Storm Nadine that made landfall on Saturday. This was south of the Cancun, Cozumel, Tulum area. This was down around the Belize coastline, or it was on the Belize coastline. And that moved inland, brought a lot of heavy rain to southern parts of Mexico. And then very quickly, in a very surprise kind of intensification, a tropical wave formed into Hurricane Oscar. And that was a Category 1, and it made a landfall in the Bahamas, just on one island in the Bahamas, and then moved in and made another landfall in the eastern part of Cuba. So yeah, that made the 9th hurricane of the season and the 15th named storm of the hurricane season. So yeah, it continues, and we'll probably have more, by the way. It's just that, I don't think that we're under any sort of threat, but we are going to add to those totals on what is going to turn out to be actually a surprisingly busy season. I say surprisingly because we went through a little lull there where not that much was happening. This is a loop of 24 hours from Saturday through Sunday this past weekend. And I want to show you that swirl there was Tropical Storm Nadine that moved right across the southern parts of Mexico and parts of Guatemala as well. Very dangerous flooding. And then some of the remnants of that might actually end up over here south of Acapulco and could re-strengthen into a tropical storm at some point this week. And then we had this really, really rapid intensification of Oscar that went from being a pretty ragged looking tropical wave. And by the way, the National Hurricane Center prediction of its chances of intensification were down to 10% at one point, and then it just all of a sudden ramped up to a hurricane before moving into Cuba. All right, closer to home, speaking of things heating up, in the tropics, we're heating back up again. We've been running very hot. When you look at the last 31 days, we had 2 days last week where we were below average. So this chart shows us all of the days' average temperatures and were they above normal or below normal. And it was just Wednesday and Thursday last week where we had a temperature that was below average. Every other day, in fact, going all the way back, I believe, to September 12th, we've been above average every single one of those days, except for 2. And then we were back above average, of course, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and will be again today. And probably in fact, not just probably, I can almost guarantee it, every single day this week, we're going to be above average. In fact, when we look at, a few moments ago, I was sharing with you the winter outlook, but let's just focus on the shorter term outlook. This week and heading into this weekend. So this is the look ahead for this weekend, Saturday through the day before Halloween. And you'll see this red here indicates the likelihood for above average temperatures. Right now, it looks like almost a guarantee we're going to be running above average. And then much of Texas here, when you take a look at the precipitation outlook for the same time period, actually, this is from just heading into this weekend and early next week, showing the likelihood for below average rainfall across the state of Texas. And this is something we've been talking about recently is drought, which is pretty crazy because, we talked, the end of last year and the beginning of this year, it was like drought, 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 drought. And then all of a sudden, it was like a faucet got opened late April when we started with flooding up around the Huntsville area and the Livingston area and kind of spread to Houston. Early May, we had flooding. Throughout the month of May, off and on, June, July, it was like rain, rain, rain. And then finally, beginning of September, it all shut off. And we've really had very little rain. The month of September in Houston, we had on average about 2 inches of rain across the area for the month. And so far in the month of October, most places have had zero rain, even as we head into the, wrapping up the third week of the month. So we have drifted back into a drought. Moderate drought is what we're considered to be at right now, but we are slipping back into a severe drought over here in the Beaumont area and just almost making its way into Liberty County and Chambers County. And with no real rain on the way for this week, nothing significant, we're probably going to see this area of severe drought start to spread. We're going to see the area of moderate drought start to spread. These areas here that are classified as being abnormally dry will probably start to get included in the moderate drought area. Same thing up here around Livingston and Cold Spring and back over to around Huntsville. Areas that have slipped back into what's considered abnormally dry are going to be back into the moderate drought. So yeah, it's going to become a bit more of a big deal, I think, around here. And that is why we have most of our counties now. Let's just assume all of them. A couple of them have been holdouts so far, but for the most part, just about all areas here in Southeast Texas, and in fact, more than 100 counties across the state of Texas, are under burn bans. Now, these are declared by county judges. The judge will sign an edict, an order. Actually, it's like a declaration of an emergency, which is an emergency order saying that you're prohibited from doing any outdoor burning. Now, the majority of you, if you live in the city of Houston, you're probably not doing any outdoor burning. Or if you live in the surrounding suburbs, but if you live out in the country, a lot of people will burn refuse and things like that. Or if you prune a tree or, hack down some, tall grass or whatever, some people will put it in a pile and kind of, burn it in a bonfire kind of thing. We just can't do that because the embers, even if you have watered, properly your own area, around the fire that you're going to set, and that's not going to be set ablaze, these embers can get picked up. I mean, we've seen that in some of these summers, especially where we're super hot. Those embers can get picked up and carried, a few hundred yards away and start a fire there. So can't have that happen. We got to make sure that we observe and respect the burn bans that have been put into effect. Finally, I want to remind you or let you know about Fox Local. So you know that Fox Local has been our platform, our streaming platform on our smart TVs. And so you can download it. Remember I wrote that little jingle. You can download it for your smart TV, whether it's Amazon or, Apple TV or whatever you got, Roku. You could download Fox Local and watch all of our news and local content. But now it is available for your phone. So you can take us with you anywhere. You'll get live newscasts, all of our newscasts. You'll get this program that you're watching now. You'll also get JD's Hurricane Gear Test. You'll get Allison's Cooking Diary and Tracking the Tropics with Ramisha, where she does her evening look at the tropics, and all of the added content. For example, if we're going to be doing storm coverage that might not necessarily be for severe weather that you would see on the air, us, breaking into programming, you might see that we're covering it for you on our streaming platform. A perfect example would be maybe we're showing a great NFL football game and we have some storms in the area, and it's not necessarily something that we're going to cut off the game for just because there's a bit of rain, but you might find some of that coverage, if necessary, on our Fox Local platforms, on our smart TVs and phones. So thank you so much for joining me here for Mondays with Mike. I really do appreciate it. I want to give a shout out to my mom and my brother Neil down in Florida. They avoided any of the big impacts from Helene and Milton, so that was really good news. And so hope you all are doing great. Hope to see you soon. And everybody out there, have a great week. Enjoy this nice warm weather.